Welcome back, everyone, to In with Denoux featuring Jordan and Gio. Although today we are minus Jordan and Gio. And if you've watched past episodes where I've been solo, you'll know that I am going to try to keep this episode a little shorter than we normally go, since I don't want to drone on and on by myself. But I do want to just go ahead and jump into the topic that we're going to be talking about today. I thought through what I wanted to do as a solo episode. And as you guys know, I really love diving into topics on the scriptures and breaking them down and trying to make them easier to understand. And so I've been doing a series on TikTok of short videos of walking through the Bible in a year. So I'm doing about 4 to 7 episodes a week, basically breaking down each book of the Bible. In certain weeks, I'll do two books in 1 week, because obviously there's 66 books and only 52 weeks in a year. But I've been reading through the Old Testament, and I'm in Joshua at the moment. But when I was reading through Leviticus, it just reminded me of this really cool connection from the Old Testament to the New Testament, that if you've been a Christian for a long time, you've probably heard this, maybe not dive deep into it, but I'm sure you've heard the thought and the idea, and just something that's not super well known if you haven't heard it in a sermon or figured that out on your own through reading old manuscripts or whatever it may be. But I wanted to dive into one of the most poetic and theologically rich moments in the entire gospel narrative, in my opinion. And it's this choice between Jesus and Barabbas. So when Jesus is going to the cross, as we know, it's a scene that many of us have read and know intimately, where Pilate stands before the crowd and he offers a choice. It's Jesus of Nazareth and it's Barabbas. And obviously we know the crowd chooses Barabbas. There's this scene of, everyone yelling, crucify him, crucify him. So Jesus is condemned and Barabbas is released. But there is a layer beneath this story, and many of you might know where I'm going with this, but many people have never heard about it. So there are some ancient manuscripts that tell us that Barabbas's full name would have been Jesus Barabbas. So I want you to reimagine that scene that we just painted of the two men and Pilate and hearing the people make the choice of Barabbas. So imagine the scene this way. Pilate says to the crowd, which of these Jesuses do you want me to release to you? Jesus called the Messiah or Jesus Barabbas? So you have two men with this identical name, or at least part of their name, and one is guilty, as we know, and one, Jesus Christ, is innocent. And one is set free and one is condemned, as we all know all too well. And so suddenly this moment begins to echo this ancient ritual from the book of Leviticus, which I was reading through a few weeks ago. And there's this ritual of the two goats, which happens on the Day of Atonement. And basically what happens is one goat is killed and the other is released into the wilderness. So one is killed for the sins of the people. The other ones, they lay hands on it and basically lay sins that, still might happen on this one goat and release it into the wilderness. And so today we're going to explore a little bit of the historical and textual evidence behind Barabbas possibly being named Jesus, because obviously it's been left out of, manuscripts that we read now. What Barabbas's name actually means, like the full name, the Levitical scapegoat ritual that we just mentioned, and how these stories mirror each other from the Old Testament to the New Testament. What this tells us about substitution and sin and grace, and why this moment is one of the clearest visual pictures that we have of the gospel, in my opinion. So this isn't, something to add to a Bible trivia or whatever. This is just theologically told, a story that is theologically told through the Old Testament to the New Testament. And so I want us to begin there, and we'll start with, who was Barabbas? So the Gospels describe Barabbas as a criminal, as we know. In the book of Matthew, it calls him a notorious prisoner. The books of Luke and Mark say that he was involved in insurrection and murder. And the book of John says that he was a bandit or a revolutionary. So Barabbas was not just like a petty thief that stole some bread or something like that. He was likely a political revolutionary, a man who used violence against Rome. And in the first century Judah, some people viewed men like Barabbas as like freedom fighters, like we would think today as freedom fighters. And others saw him as a dangerous extremist or a terrorist, if you will. And so others, either way, whichever way you kind of viewed him back then, he represented a violent rebellion of some sort. And so let's take a look at his name, Jesus Barabbas. And so Barabbas is Aramaic, and Bar means son of, and Abba means father, as we know. So Barabbas literally means son of the father. And already that should make you pause because it's so similar, because Jesus is constantly called son of the father. The Jesus that we follow is called son of the father. So we have Jesus, true son of the father, and Barabbas, son of the father. Two sons, two, similar names, two paths, and one path chose violence, right? He's a criminal. He's not just a petty theft. He is a violent criminal. And one chooses self-sacrifice. Now, here's where things get even a little bit more interesting. And this is this thought of, was Barabbas's name actually Jesus? So in Matthew 27, verses 16 and 17, some ancient Greek manuscripts include this detail that Jesus Barabbas was his name. So the text would read, "Which Jesus do you want me to release to you? Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?" And not all manuscripts include this. Some later copies remove the name Jesus that's in front of Barabbas. And the reason this is that many scholars believed that scribes would feel uncomfortable with a criminal sharing the name of Jesus, but earlier manuscripts preserved it, which I think is very important. There's already so many people that have a hard time with the scriptures. Are they man-made? Is Jesus really was God really involved with the writing of the Bible? And so I think it's really important that, and I honestly think it just makes for this cool mirror and comparison of Old Testament and New Testament. So I think it's really great that some of the old manuscripts keep that detail in it. So some of the earlier manuscripts, there's one called Origen, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but a 3rd century church father comments that many manuscripts in his day contained the name Jesus Barabbas, though he personally disliked it and believed it should be removed. And so it tells us something that's important. The idea did not originate with modern scholars. It was circulating very, very early, which is important with history to know, was this true, was this not, which really does point to it being true that his name was Jesus. So if it is true, Pilate literally stands before the crowd holding two prisoners, Jesus Barabbas and Jesus the Messiah. And this detail of the same names kind of transforms the entire scene here. It becomes this theological drama, if you will. Which Jesus do you want? The one who kills his enemies or the one who dies for them? It's really, really compelling. And, one takes life, the other gives life. The one who mirrors our rage or the one who mirrors God's heart, right? We are Jesus Barabbas in many ways, right? We are him. And we chose him to be freed instead of Jesus. And so obviously, like we just said, the crowd chooses the wrong Jesus. They choose Jesus Barabbas, and yet the wrong choice becomes the very mechanism to our salvation, the bridge to our salvation. And so I want to go into this Day of Atonement in Leviticus and talk a little bit about this mirroring images that we get from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And to understand why this matters, we need to go back to Leviticus 16. So the chapter of Leviticus 16 describes Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. So once a year, the high priest would perform this ritual to cleanse Israel from sin. So 2 goats were selected, right? They were presented to the Lord, lots were cast, and 1 goat was chosen for the Lord, and the other was chosen for Azazel, or it's often translated as the scapegoat, which we all know what that means, and it makes perfect sense. So the first goat that was chosen was sacrificed. Its blood was brought into the Holy of Holies, and atonement was made for the sins of Israel. And the second goat was kept alive, and this is what would happen, which I described a little bit earlier, but I'll describe it with a little bit more detail. The priest would lay his hands on the head of this second goat. He would confess the sins of the people over it, and symbolically transferring guilt of the sin from the people to the goat. Then the goat was sent into the wilderness, and it was a symbol that it carried the sins away from God's people. So the ritual had two movements. It had death and it had a removal. Blood makes atonement, and then sin is carried away. So you have two goats. One dies, one is released. Hold on to that for later. And then I want to talk about this parallel between the goats and the two Jesuses. And you can kind of see the baseline of the parallel, but I want to return to Pilate's courtyard, where they're choosing between Jesus Barabbas and Jesus of Nazareth. You know, lots are not physically cast here when they're talking about the two Jesuses like we see with the goats back in Leviticus 16. But symbolically, there is a decision is made, which is basically casting lots, that one will die like the first goat and one will be set free like the second goat. And Jesus the Messiah is condemned to die, and Jesus Barabbas is released, just like the two goats. One is sacrificed, one is sent away alive. But the symbolism goes deeper than that, because in Leviticus, the goat that is released carries sin into the wilderness. And Barabbas is a sinner, a murderer, a rebel, and yet he walks free. And Jesus the Messiah is innocent, yet he dies. The roles are reversed. The guilty goes free and the innocent is punished. And that is what we talked about earlier with the substitution. You know, not theoretically, not abstractly, visual, concrete substitution. Barabbas doesn't hear about substitution. He experiences it himself. He is the one that should go to the cross and die. The cross is meant for Barabbas, but the cross Jesus carries is quite literally Barabbas's. He carries it for us all, but he literally carried it for Barabbas, which is just mind-blowing. It's just such a cool narrative. And so Barabbas wakes up that morning condemned. I am going to go to the cross, is what Barabbas is thinking when he wakes up, and when he goes to sleep that night, he is a free man. And Jesus wakes up a free man and goes to sleep in a tomb. You know, this is the gospel acted out before it is even explained, right? We see it happening before the church goes on to explode because of these moments. And so I want to talk a little bit about how Barabbas is the mirror for us and who we are. You know, Barabbas isn't just a historical figure. When we look in the mirror, that is who we are. He represents humanity, right? We are guilty, just like Barabbas was guilty. We are flawed. We have rebelled. All these things that Barabbas did, we do. And yet we walk free. Not because we earned it, not because we repented enough or loved God enough, because we cleaned ourselves up. None of that. It's not because of any of that, but because someone, Jesus Christ, took our place, right? You know, Barabbas never asked for forgiveness. In the story, he never thanks Jesus. We don't know what that day was really like for him, right? He never says a word that we know of, but grace happens to him anyways. And that sometimes can offend our sense of fairness. You know, I am someone that is very I want justice to be done. And it's part of the reason why, you know, when things happen in my life, it's hard for me to just move past disrespect or lies or things of that nature, because my sense of justice. And yet sometimes I can aim that incorrectly, because if I really wanted true justice, you know, it would be that I don't deserve a chance at grace. Barabbas didn't deserve a chance at grace, and yet he got it. That is what the nature of grace is, right? We get something that we don't deserve, and, you know, we don't get something that we do deserve. And if salvation waited for gratitude, for our gratitude, no one would be saved, right? Jesus went ahead and did it before we never earned it, but before we asked for it, before we asked for forgiveness, it was given to us. And so here are some things that Barabbas shows us. It shows us that the cross was not a reaction to human goodness. It was a response to human brokenness. It was what we needed. So I want to talk about the two sons of the Father, these two Jesuses. So you have Jesus's identity, the Son of the Father, One is a false son and one is a true son. The false son lives and the true son dies. So why is that? It's so that false sons everywhere, all of us, false sons and daughters, can become real sons, right? In John, Jesus' prayer before he goes to the cross about, so we can be one as they are one. That's the whole point of all of this, is that the false sons and daughters can become real, true sons and daughters of God. So rebels can become children, so that slaves can become heirs of the Almighty. Jesus doesn't just take the actual punishment from Barabbas on that day. He takes punishment from all of us. And it's beautiful that in the third book of the Bible, we already see it. I've talked a lot about this with Gio about, the creation story is that Jesus wasn't plan B. He was plan A, and we see it from the very, very beginning. And it's already painting a picture of what it will look like for Jesus to take on our sin, for the guilty to go free. He takes that punishment. He takes not only Barabbas's identity, he takes all of our identity on the cross. Barabbas goes from a condemned man to a free man. Believers go from sinners to sons and daughters. This is adoption theology embedded in the story that God has given us. It's written in. And I want to talk about the crowd that condemned him and the human heart, and why the crowd chooses Barabbas, right? Barabbas looks like the savior they wanted, right? We talked a little bit about how he's a revolutionist. He's starting a revolution. Like, that's what everyone thought that Jesus Christ was going to come and do, right? He's going to overthrow the government. He's going to start a war and bring God's people to the top, when really he's like, no, you have to become like the least of these. And so Barabbas looked like what they really wanted at the beginning from Jesus Christ. They wanted someone radical. They wanted someone violent. They wanted someone who was going to start a revolution. Barabbas fights, he resists, he spills blood. It's what they wanted from Jesus. But Jesus came and he talked about loving your enemy, not battling them and overthrowing them, turning the other cheek. Humanity consistently prefers power over purity. We see that every single day in our world. You're seeing it in the craziest of ways right now, right? You're seeing it with how we treat people who come into our country, whether it's legally or illegally. We talked about that with ICE, right? I'm not going to go into it, but you see it when all the Epstein files come out and what was going on there. Power over purity, quite literally. We prefer force over forgiveness. We already just talked about that. But the kingdom of God does not arrive through domination, right? It arrives through sacrifice. And still today, people choose their version of Jesus, just like the crowd looked at Jesus Barabbas and said, that's what Jesus was supposed to look like. They wanted a political Jesus, a self-help Jesus, a prosperity Jesus, right? But not a crucified one. And so Pilate's question echoes across history still today of, which Jesus do you want? Do you want the one that just erases all the pain and doesn't give us a choice whether to love him or not? Or do you want someone who loves and forgives and doesn't try to win through bloodshed and war, but through sacrifice? Which Jesus do you want is the question that's still asked to us every single day. So I want to talk to you a little bit also about this scapegoat and the cross and this mirror that we see. The scapegoat ritual finds its fulfillment in Christ, right? All the sacrifices of the Old Testament were a placeholder until Jesus comes on the scene, right? That was like a holdover. There's so much more deep stuff we could get into that, but for the sake of argument, it was a holdover until Jesus, the true one sacrifice, could cover all. See, Jesus is actually both goats. He is the sacrifice whose blood atones for sin, right? And he is the bearer of the sin who carries it away, right? We talked about the two goats, how one has to die for the atonement of sin, and then hands are placed on the second to transfer all of the remaining sin onto this goat and sent away. But Jesus represents both. He dies for our sin, and he removes the stain that we have. And the cross is that altar. The cross is the altar of the goat from Leviticus 16, but it's for once and for all. Resurrection is the proof that sin stayed buried. And then Jesus resurrects and now intercedes for us, right? Carries our sin away from us and intercedes between us and God. See, Barabbas only experienced half of the ritual, and Jesus completes all of it. So I want to talk to you about what this brings into question for us personally. So I want you to imagine Barabbas. I love the thought of what is going through Barabbas's mind on this day. I wish we had an account. You hear your name if you're Barabbas, right? You expect chains and you expect death, and instead you hear you're free. And you step into the sunlight, you watch a man carry the cross that was meant for you, right? What do you do with that? That's heavy. I can only imagine. And we don't know what Barabbas did, right? The Bible doesn't tell us what happens the rest of Barabbas's life, but maybe that's intentional, because now the story becomes ours. Like I said, we are Barabbas. So what's your life story? What are you doing to complete the narrative that Jesus died for you and now you're free when you are the guilty party, right? You are Barabbas. I am Barabbas. So what do we do with the freedom that we didn't earn, right? It's why politics frustrates me so much, and I will not go into it, but we spend so much time battling each other because you're left and I'm right and you're left, or I'm left and you're right, whatever, that we're battling for our rights, and we're battling for what makes the most sense for me. And Jesus died for all of us. And that doesn't mean that you don't, I'm not saying don't vote or don't, push for what you believe is right. But what are you doing with your freedom that you didn't earn? And are you sharing that with others? Are you holding it in? Are you sharing, hey, look, I'm guilty, you're guilty, but we can be free? Do you ignore it? Do you exploit it? I know I've done those things. Or do you surrender to the one that gave it to you, right? So in closing, you had two Jesuses, two choices, one crowd, one cross. Only one is going to go to the cross, and only one is going to be set free. And Barabbas walks free, and Jesus walks into Golgotha. The Son of God becomes that scapegoat from Leviticus 16. And it's so that we can become true sons of God. It's not a metaphor. This is the heartbreak of Christianity, right? Not self-improvement, not, moral high ground, but substitution. Someone took your place, and his name is Jesus Christ, not Jesus Barabbas. So I hope that this thought, I just love this thought. I love this study. You should look into it more. It's so beautiful. And, we've talked a lot, on the podcast about the story of the Bible, and, me walking through this series on TikTok of the Bible in a year has just been so powerful, to even do these 30-second to a minute videos and just seeing all over again how the story of God just goes together, how it winds together, how you have this story of what it's supposed to be in the garden, the fall of man, all the history that ensues, from the books after the Torah, and then all the beautiful Psalms and poems and things that are written, how it all points to this moment of Jesus taking on our sin and dying so that we can be true sons and daughters of God. It's just a beautiful thing. And, I just want to implore you, because the thought, thinking through why I wanted to do this, and I won't go deep into this, I don't want to gossip, but, I had a very difficult conversation with a church leader recently, and I brought to him a very elementary biblical principle that I was holding him to. And the short of it is that it was clear to me that he didn't understand it at all. And I just want to implore you, if you're a Christian, and especially a leader, if you're teaching people, if you're leading people, to know what you're talking about. And I don't claim to always know what I'm talking about. I know I've made mistakes, probably on this podcast, and trust me, please point them out to me, because I do not want to be someone that teaches someone something incorrectly from the scriptures. And obviously a lot of what we talk about on here is perspective, it's not gospel. But when you have principles that are simple principles, and you don't understand them, you have to be able to teach people correctly. If you're going to stand on a stage, if you're going to call yourself a minister or a pastor, you have to understand what it is that you're reading to people and what you're teaching to people. And there was just this thought of, I want to teach people and I want to do it correctly and I want to do it the right way. And I want to be able to understand things so that I can teach people. And so there was just this thought of, okay, I want to dive into a topic to teach people about something, because it was just bothering me, that conversation. The conversation went well, it went great. I really appreciated the conversation, but it was something that just scared me a little bit, if I'm being completely honest. And I think I've seen a lot over the past year that a lot of people want to call themselves Christians and preach the gospel, but when they are called to a biblical principle, or when they are called something that the scriptures tell us to do as brothers and sisters in Christ, they run from it and they don't want to do it, or they point out your wrongs so that they don't have to accept their wrongs. That's been a big part of my life this past year. And like I said, I want to be vulnerable on this podcast and just know that I have made so many mistakes in my life. And I feel like I've really tried to stand up when I've made mistakes and do things the way God calls you to do them when you have fallen, or when you've sinned, or when you've wandered, or when you've wronged someone, or if you've been wronged. The Bible teaches us about those things. And if you're a Christian, you can't ignore them when you're going through it. You can't point other people to them and not abide by them yourself. And so I want to say that so that if any of you feel that way towards me, if you feel I've wronged you in any type of way, or if I've taught something incorrectly on this podcast or otherwise, to point it out to me, and I will do my best to be humble and to hear that correction, because I do not want to be the people that do the opposite. And a lot of things that have happened in my life this year, I've dedicated that I will not be that way. And I know I've done it in the past, and I know I'll do it in the future, but I want to publicly be a man of integrity to the best of my ability. And so if there is anything that anybody that is listening, has some sort of feelings towards me, or, I don't know if maybe this is terrible to invite on myself, but, if you have things that, you're carrying in your heart that I've contributed to, please contact me. Please contact me. DM me if you have my number. Call me, text me, leave me a voice note, whatever it is that you feel comfortable doing. Please do it. So anyways, I hope that this episode really helps you. I love this narrative of Jesus, Barabbas, and Jesus Christ. It's such a beautiful mirroring of Leviticus 16 into the New Testament. And so there's these connections that I'm kind of remaking as I read through the scriptures and doing this series on the Bible in a year. And if you enjoyed this, I would love to do more things like this and bring Gio in, bring Jordan in. So I really hope that you guys enjoyed this. As always, please like, comment, share. We would love if we could get as many people sharing the podcast and commenting on the podcast. And if you want to be a guest, I'm looking for guests that want to share their testimony or share their favorite story, share that whatever you want to share about the scriptures or just about your life in general. If you feel like you've gone through something powerful and come out the other side, whether it has to do with depression and anxiety, whether it has to do with losing someone, people need those stories, and we need people that, even sometimes when it's hard to tell those stories, if there's anyone that feels comfortable, we would love to have you on to talk about those things, especially with everything that's going on in our world. We need people to help one another. We need positivity. We need to hear the good side of bad stories, right? If things that have negative, if things that are negative have happened to you and you've come out strong on the other side and you have your faith, or maybe you're wanting to find your faith, we want to hear those stories, and we'd love to really give people a platform. Although our platform is tiny, we hope to grow it so that stories like this can be told. So if that's something that sounds enticing to you, please reach out. We'd love to have you on. But as always, we love you guys, and we will be back next week. And as Jordan always says, I'm out.